In this video, we will discuss 3 factors which I think are underrated and overrated for building muscle. First, let's go through some variables and techniques which I think are underrated. This doesn't mean they are going to have the largest impact on long-term muscle growth, I just think that more people could make effective use of them. The first of which are metabolite techniques. This is a general term which refers to a collection of training strategies. They are generally characterized by some combination of short rest periods, lighter loads, and training close to failure. Some examples include drop sets, myo reps, pre-fatigue, supersets, and assisted reps. The reasons I think these are underrated training strategies are for 3 primary reasons. First is for time efficiency. Metabolite techniques allow you to produce a highly effective training stimulus in a short time frame. Traditional training is generally a little more hypertrophic on a per set basis, but metabolite techniques usually allow you to complete more work in a shorter time frame. And as a result, we are often able to produce a similar or even superior stimulus in a shorter time frame. For example, this study compared the effects of traditional versus drop set training. 9 untrained men had each arm assigned to one of either 3 bicep curl training protocols 2 to 3 times per week for 8 weeks. One condition involved 3 sets to failure at 80% 1RM. The second condition involved 3 sets to failure at 30% 1RM, and the third condition involved performing 1 set at 80% 1RM to failure, followed immediately by 4 additional drop sets with a 10 to 15% decrease in load, with all drop sets also taken to failure. It was found that biceps cross-sectional area increased similarly in all 3 conditions, with no notable differences between them. However, the total duration of each protocol differed substantially between conditions. The drop sets were completed more than 3 times faster than the heavy load protocol and more than 5 times faster than the light load protocol, while still being able to achieve equal muscle growth. The second reason I think metabolite techniques are underrated is for joint stress. Since many of these strategies rely on high acute fatigue, they often require lighter loads to be used. This limits joint stress and can help minimize the risk of injury or joint pain, promoting greater longevity through your lifting journey. For example, this study compared the effects of traditional versus pre-exhaust training on muscle growth. 24 untrained men performed 3 sets of leg press to failure with 75% 1RM, 2 times per week for 9 weeks. Half the subjects performed the leg press with no specific intervention, while the other half performed 1 set of leg extensions to failure with 20% 1RM immediately before the leg press training. As we would expect, total tonnage during the leg press was lower in the pre-exhaust group compared with the traditional training. However, muscle thickness of the quadriceps and glutes increased to a similar magnitude in both groups. And the third reason is for engagement and enjoyment. Metabolite techniques usually limit passive rest time, so you spend more time training as a proportion of your workout rather than resting. I think this is important because extended rest times can often cause us to get distracted and can shift our focus away from training. So limiting passive rest can keep you more engaged and motivated during workouts. And it can also provide a novel training style that you can incorporate every now and again for some variation. Moving on to the second underrated training strategy, we have antagonist paired sets. This is the concept of alternating between sets of 2 different exercises which train opposing muscle groups. This allows one muscle group to recover while the opposing muscle group is working. For example, you could alternate between a bench press and a row, or a biceps and triceps exercise. The reason I think this is an underrated training strategy is similar to the reasons mentioned for metabolite techniques. They can provide an equivalent hypertrophic stimulus to traditional training within a shorter duration. For example, this study compared the effects of performing traditional versus antagonist supersets on muscle growth. 43 males and females with at least 1 year of resistance training experience performed the following exercises for 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps, 2 times per week for 8 weeks. Half the subjects trained by performing each set with 2 minutes rest, while the other half trained by alternating between the antagonist exercise and only resting after 1 set of each exercise was completed. It was found that muscle thickness at all sites increased to a similar magnitude in all groups, with no significant differences between them. However, average session duration was significantly shorter in the superset group compared with the traditional training group. And the other reason I think this style of training is underrated is also for the engagement and enjoyment benefits. Just like metabolite techniques, you spend less time sitting around waiting and potentially getting distracted, and spend more time actually lifting. Although it should be noted that this strategy might not be viable in all cases. In a public gym, it might be difficult or just bad etiquette to take multiple pieces of equipment at once. And the third factor I think is underrated for muscle growth is the use of internal sensations. This refers to internal feedback such as the mind-muscle connection, the pump, muscle soreness, and stretch. The reason I think that using internal sensations are underrated is because they can be commonly dismissed as useless information that has no relevance to long-term muscle growth. I think it is true that if we take this internal feedback too far, it can become misleading and result in providing an inferior hypertrophic stimulus. But I do think these sensations can play a useful role in hypertrophy training that is sometimes underappreciated. Internal sensations can help us guide training decisions to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus and minimize injury risk. Essentially, we want to train in a way that promotes high internal muscular stress and limits joint stress. We can use internal feedback to adjust technique, exercise selection, rep ranges, and so on to determine what gives us the best stimulus and least joint stress. For example, let's say you were performing a seated cable row. If you adjust technique in a way that provides a better mind-muscle connection and gets you sore in the mid-back the following day, then that was probably a good change to make. Or if you find that touching the dumbbell a little wider during a bench press gives you a greater stretch on the chest, then that is also probably a positive adjustment. Alternatively, if overhead press variants never feel comfortable on your shoulder joints, no matter what technique you use, then maybe lateral raise variations are going to be a better option for your long-term joint health. Now let's move on to some variables that I think are a little overrated. Again, this doesn't mean they aren't important, I just think that sometimes too much emphasis is placed on them. The first overrated variable is the use of specific rest periods. By this I mean implementing rest periods which are thought to be optimal or ideal. It is true that moderate and longer rest periods generally promote more favourable muscle growth compared with short rest periods. However, the magnitude of these benefits is pretty minimal. Even when training with very short rest periods, significant muscle growth is able to be achieved. And if you get distracted and end up resting a little too long, you also aren't going to compromise muscle growth to any significant extent. This was established in this meta-regression, which analysed the influence of rest periods on muscle growth. Rest periods were categorised into short rest, defined as less than 1 minute, moderate rest, defined as 1 to 2 minutes, long rest, defined as 2 to 3 minutes, and very long rest, defined as 3 minutes or longer. It was found that although moderate and longer rest periods tended to produce slightly superior muscle growth, even short rest periods were able to promote significant growth. So really, no matter how long you rest, you are going to provide a great hypertrophic stimulus. It probably makes sense to rest a little longer for some exercises and shorter for others, but you don't need to stress too much about it. Furthermore, you don't even need to time rest periods either if you don't want to. You could just go based on when you feel ready to perform the next set. The second overrated variable we will discuss is the implementation of strict progressive overload. This refers to specific systems which require you to increase load and/or reps in a specific way over time. In theory, this makes sense. Increasing reps and load over time is a way to provide a more challenging stimulus over time. But in reality, it is impossible to predict your rate of progression over time. Your rate of progression will differ based on numerous factors, including genetics, training age, the specific exercise, sleep, nutrition, and more. Furthermore, your rate of progression usually changes when you adjust variables in your lifting routine. If you change your training split, your volume, exercise order within a workout, exercise selection, or lifting technique, your rate of progression will now change too. And the issue is that following a strict pre-planned progression model might actually come at the expense of the hypertrophic stimulus. For example, this can commonly occur by adding reps or load over time at the expense of effective technique. This would allow a lifter to look like they have progressed on paper, but in reality, the hypertrophic stimulus they provided may not have been greater. So instead of following a rigid progression system, I would recommend focusing on trying to make each set as stimulative as possible as the number one priority. And then you can allow progressive overload to occur at the natural rate that your biology permits. And the final overrated variable we will discuss is intentional bulking. This refers to going through phases where the goal is to intentionally gain weight for the purposes of building muscle mass. It is true that bulking usually does result in greater muscle growth compared with maintaining or cutting. However, bulking usually results in disproportionately more fat gain compared with muscle gain. And in modern developed societies, most people are trying to reduce body fat rather than gain body fat. For example, this study compared the effects of bulking at two different rates on body composition. 39 elite athletes were recruited from the Norwegian Olympic Sports Centre who were performing their regular sport practice in addition to 4 resistance training sessions per week. Half the subjects gained an average of 1.2 kilograms over 8 to 12 weeks, while the other half gained an average of 2.7 kilograms over the same time frame. It was found that both groups gained significant lean mass, with slightly greater gains seen in the group gaining more weight. However, the fast weight gain group also gained significantly more fat mass too. And if we were to take this to the extreme, the results become even more pronounced. This study compared body compositions between sumo wrestlers, bodybuilders, and the general population. The sumo wrestlers were the heaviest, followed by the bodybuilders, then the general population. The sumo wrestlers also carried the most lean mass, 10 kilograms more than the bodybuilders. However, they also carried significantly more body fat too. And in most cases, significant lean mass will be lost with significant weight loss, if you were to then subsequently reduce body fat after a bulk. So really, most people probably aren't concerned with the absolute amount of muscle they have. The goal is to have the highest proportion of muscle mass at a given body weight. This doesn't mean intentional bulking is never recommended. There are some instances where bulking is probably going to be a good idea. The first of which is for novice lifters. Because novice lifters are highly receptive to training, they can often bulk with minimal gains in fat mass. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of eating at maintenance versus a surplus while resistance training in novices. 73 untrained men performed a resistance training program 4 times per week for 8 weeks. Subjects were split into 3 groups, with all groups instructed to consume their regular habitual diet. However, 2 of the groups were also provided with a 2,000 calorie supplement to consume in addition to their regular diet. One was a mostly carbohydrate supplement, and the other was a mixed carbohydrate and protein supplement. It was found that the group consuming their regular diet roughly maintained body weight, while the other 2 groups gained around 3 kilograms each. All groups gained significant fat-free mass, with the 2 surplus groups gaining a greater amount. The maintenance group lost some fat mass, while the 2 surplus groups approximately maintained fat mass. And the other instance where bulking is appropriate is when at very low levels of body fat. More specifically, when leaner than around 10% for males or around 18% for females. When we are this lean, we usually aren't in the healthiest state. So bulking, even if it means gaining some body fat, is a way to restore healthy physiological function. This was observed in this case study, which followed a drug-free male bodybuilder throughout a contest preparation period. This athlete lost around 9 kilograms, reaching a body fat level of around 5% before gaining weight once again. During this period, it was found that many hormone markers dropped or increased beyond healthy levels, as shown by the dotted lines. However, these markers then returned to normal levels as weight was regained. Furthermore, anaerobic performance also suffered, but was also restored once weight was regained. And that concludes our underrated and overrated list of training variables. Let me know what you think of this list, and if you have any additional variables you would add. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.